Gather round, dads, it's time for a tale. Hand me a book and a warm pint of ale. Let's discuss writing and the literary gods with Dan Roberts on the Dadlit Pod.
Welcome to the Dadlit Pod, the literary podcast for those of us who know the legend lives on from the Chippewa on down of the big lake they called Gitchigumi. Superior, they said, never gives up her dead when the gales of November come early. Tonight, I am joined by Norrin Ripsman.
Good to be
He
here.
he writes fiction. He's a professor of international relations at Lehigh University. So that means he's very fit because he has to go up and down that hill all day. He was born in Canada. He's lived in 11 cities in 6 countries and three continents. He received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. Well done. And has lived in suburban Philadelphia since 2016, which, by the way, is a beautiful place to live. I love Media, Pennsylvania,
Oh,
personally.
sure.
He's written compelling short stories, uh, a, and he is also the author of the novel The Oracle of Spring Garden and a forthcoming novel, Bullet Holes. Uh, all feature relationships between fathers and children. And this, according to you, features quite prominently in your fiction, Norrin.
That's correct.
Norrin, what got you to write Dadlit?
Well, I'll tell you, my journey to writing started a long, long, long time ago. And so there's an original story, and then there's what happened more recently. So when I was 15 years old, I started writing. I wrote a prologue in the first 4 chapters of what was going to be a novel, but never actually finished. I still have that. It is something I would never write now, but it's something I showed to my girls when they each turned 15 to show them what I was up to at the time. Um, but I always wanted to write fiction. I love fiction, but I needed to learn things and I needed the push. And one thing is I learned writing academic books. I have 10 academic books that are out there. And I learned that I didn't have to write from beginning to end, which was what was stopping me earlier on
Mm.
whenever I tried, because I got stuck at a point and couldn't move on. Whereas with an academic book, you've got a plan and you work on multiple chapters as you're doing the research and going through it. So I found that that's how I could write fiction. But that wasn't what got me started in the end. In the end, in the fall of 2019, my father, who was 80, almost, yeah, 87 at the time, was diagnosed with kidney cancer. And
Mhm.
I went up, I drove to Canada, to Toronto from Philadelphia to be with him for his first two chemo treatments. Then they closed the border down and I couldn't get up there for a while, unfortunately. But I was there for the first two treatments before COVID. And then he was really bored because they told him that he had a compromised immune system and couldn't see people because a common cold could kill him. And he was a very sociable person, so he was telling me how bored he was when I was up there, talking to him. And I said, "Well, Dad, you've always wanted to write fiction. Why don't you do it now?" Because he had always, he doesn't, he wouldn't have written the stuff that I've written. Although I do have one short story for him in my collection that I deliberately wrote for him, called Special Delivery, about a mishap in the delivery room. That's a more satire and bizarre, but he thought that the greatest book in the history of the planet was The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy,
I
and
mean,
he would have
yeah.
loved to have written that. So I asked him why he didn't write fiction, and he said, "Noran, it's too damn late." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Listen, I had ideas when I was younger, and I was too busy, and I also had the stamina to be able to carry it out. He says, I don't have the ideas. I can't really think clearly for long stretches of time anymore. I can't even sit in the right position that you need in order to be able to write. He says, I should have done this decades ago. Now, I had always intended to write fiction when I retired. Like I figured, okay, I've got other stuff to do now. Um, but his advice rattled around in my head for I'd like to say I started writing right away, but like a normal kid, I didn't. It took me a year and a half for his that to rattle around in my brain. And then in the summer of 2021, we rented a cottage in the Poconos, and I had a short story idea. So I wrote it. Went with it. I decided to try it, and before I finished it, I got another one, and then another one, and then that ended up becoming Songbook, which is my short story collection about there are 14 stories on the theme of classic rock music, either inspired by classic rock lyrics and music, or after I wrote them, the emotion and the feeling of the story associated in my head with a classic rock song. And so that became my first short story collection. And then I got an idea that was too big. When I was 12 stories in, I got an idea that was too big for a short story, and I realized that I had my novel there. And that became The Oracle of Spring Garden Road. But truly, if it weren't for my father, I wouldn't have taken the plunge that I've always wanted to do since I was a teenager. And I'm very grateful for him for that last bit of advice that he gave me. He even was around for me to read, to read my first short story to him. Not sure how much he got out of it at that point because he was, that was near the end. But I felt, grateful to be able to read it to him and tell him, Dad, this is because of you. So that's why I started writing it recently.
Well, that's lovely, and you've kept going.
Yeah, absolutely. It's given me a rush. I feel like I'm in my, 30s, early 30s again. By
That's great.
Yeah, no, it's
I
it's
wish I could
exciting.
feel, yeah, it's that way. Yeah.
It's exciting.
And so what continues to spur it on? I this gets asked a lot. Um, like people ask me why I do it. And it's because I like to hand off the work and delight people. I like the effect that it has. I like the idea of the conversation with the work. You know, to my mind, I'd love to give it to somebody, be there when they finish it, and then talk to them about what they thought and what they liked. What do you think really drives you in terms of why you write?
I'd say a couple of things. First of all, there's the fountain of ideas.
Hmm.
So when you're on, I don't know if you find it this way, but when I'm in that zone, I feel like it's almost prophecy. Like the ideas and the characters come to me and they talk to me, and it flows into me as if from without. And I feel with that gift, I have to like that gift of these ideas coming into my head. I feel I have to do something with them. But in
Hmm.
addition to that, I love art. I love art. I love music. Um, I am unable to convey any kind of emotion with a paintbrush and a canvas because I am the least gifted artist in the world. I also love music. I taught myself how to play saxophone a few years back, a number of years, like maybe about 7 or 8 years back. But I call myself the world's worst saxophonist because I didn't learn when I was young. So I can't write music and convey emotion with music. I can convey a lot of noise when I blow,
Mm,
but I have a paintbrush, which is my ability to paint with words. And
mm,
I can, write a story and have someone cry, or write a story and have someone get angry, and I can make someone, connect to a character or despise a character or question the choices of a character, and it's a high to see people read and respond and get emotions from something that I've created. So it makes me the painter that I've never been.
Well, it's terrific. You've also written nonfiction,
Yes.
and it sounds quite extensively written nonfiction.
Yes.
Do you see that translating in ways? Do you think that it translates in terms of the comfort with writing or the comfort with language, or do you find the two processes to be completely different?
There are things that transport from one to the other. So
Hmm.
the ability to write, to communicate efficiently does transport from one to the other. In addition, as I said, I learned from writing nonfiction that I don't have to write in a linear fashion,
Hmm.
which is the key for me. I know everyone writes differently, but that's the key for me to writing fiction. Being able to write. Right now, I have 9 chapters of I'm in the middle of my fifth novel. I've got 9 chapters open. And I'm working as I get the inspiration for something.
Hmm.
And if I don't have the inspiration for something at the moment, I stop and I wait until it comes. And that has helped me. So, in that respect, there's a lot that's helped from writing nonfiction. On the other hand, I have to get into a completely different mindset. I need to keep. I'm still working. I have an academic co-authored academic work under review right now. I have another co-authored academic work that I'm writing with my colleagues, and they're different missions, and I need to keep them separate in my mind
Hmm.
because the kind of writing I do for my day job is not at all helpful. It's not lyrical. It's not about developing characters. It's not about saying things with subtlety. It's about being very direct and very clear. So it's a that in that respect, it's a completely different mission. That's one of the things I think that stopped me also earlier. Earlier in my career, I tried to write a short story. My computer is a graveyard of story ideas and stories that I've never completed, and I think part of that is because I was writing too much. I wasn't able to shut out the nonfiction writer, and it was a little bit too wooden. And I think I found the emotion. I guess I also have to credit my father because I was in a particularly emotional place when I started writing because he and I were very, very close. He was the greatest single inspiration for me. And both intellectually and emotionally, and as a role model for being a father. And as he was sick, I felt that, and it really shaped my world, and it allowed me to get in touch with emotions that allowed me to throw aside the nonfiction and really focus on what it was that I was trying to get across on the page. And since then, I mean, then he passed away and I was in that place as well. And now, even though I'm not in that place, he passed away a good 4 years ago now. Nonetheless, I I've understood how it is that I have to open myself up to write fiction, and I'm still able to do that.
Yeah, the I want to get back to the question of the experience because I had a very similar sort of experience um, with the question of nonfiction writing to fiction writing and how one is able to adjust to that. And I think about that because I I always worried that my writing is pedantic because of my experience with nonfiction writing and writing, in a style of writing history, basically. But I'm very interested in the idea of what like a household is like that raises a person who becomes an international relations professor and then wants to write fiction and finds satisfaction in that and finds inspiration from their dad to do that. Because I have a very similar type of situation with my dad, where the prerogative of learning and the prerogative of knowledge is is considered what makes a man in my father's house. It was simply knowing history, knowing literature, being a knowledgeable person was what masculinity looked like. And I'm wondering if you have if you had a similar experience and that also might have incited this writing experience. And it sort of sounds like it did.
Yeah, first of all, I found that absolutely beautiful. But yes, I think that so my father he was a pharmacist.
Hmm.
Um, he was intellectual. He read widely. Wasn't he wasn't very aggressive. He wasn't very tough. He could be if he needed to, but he
Hmm.
like his approach to parenting was to be supportive, but to talk to me and to engage me. And we discussed things, and he treated me with respect, not quite as an equal, but that's normal. But as I got older, he did treat me more like an equal.
Hmm.
And yeah, the role model that he set for me was that someone who thinks clearly, who explores, who's curious intellectually, um, that is masculinity, right?
Yeah.
Masculinity doesn't have to be. I mean, yes, we played sports, and he played sports with me as well. Yes, we watched, hockey games and football games and baseball games, and so it wasn't like that was absent. No, that was very much a part of growing up in the household. But he made it clear that masculinity wasn't beating people up, and masculinity wasn't who's stronger or who could drink more beer. He says, of course, you go out and drink beer. That's fine. Go out but that's not what defines you. What really defines you is what you've got upstairs, how well you can articulate, but also how decently you treat people. And that
Yeah.
was something, else that, masculinity is not about belittling people.
Hmm.
And as I say, he was a very important role model as a father as well, husband, father. So um, I, I definitely feel that the kind of tone that he set had an influence in me. Also, the books he read. So he introduced me to initially when I was younger, I started getting into pulp, spy and adventure, Robert Ludlum and the like,
Hmm.
and Frederick Forsyth and my father read other things. Like he said, "Oh yeah, those are fun," but and I saw he had Graham Greene on his shelf, and he had John le Carré, which were much when I read them, I realized that I couldn't go back to these other things because these were written in a literary fashion. And then that was the entry point for me to look at Steinbeck, which was also on his shelf. And I found that reading and reading good books was a core element of who he was, and that helped
Hmm.
shape me as well.
Yeah, I had a very similar experience. Um, for me, it was when we would discuss things, it would harken back to sort of philosophical books. I frequently joke that my father's favorite book is Philip Roth's Portnoy's Complaint because it comes up constantly with him. Um, but for him, he would approach. So, even when I was 13, and I'm like, the world seems when you're 13 to be a place which is somewhat absurd, right? That school seems absurd, women seem absurd, everything seems absurd. And so he went out and bought me Catch 22 and said, read this book. And and things continued like that. With the one book that he gave me that I really hated was Siddhartha. I still hate
Okay.
Siddhartha. It's a, but anyway, yeah, and so I think he set that pattern of it was actually or is actually um, a manly pursuit to be knowledgeable and to understand things, and also to be contemplative in your morality, and to constantly be tackling that, which I find now um, is a thing that not everybody did with their kids, right?
Yes.
That wasn't just the norm, um, which was interesting. It's an interesting thing to look back on and think about the sort of literary upbringing uh, of individuals. Now, you, of course, um, like me, are a Jewish author.
Hmm.
Do you think that that has played any role in that sort of construction of parenthood and literacy and this idea of introducing text and thought and the value of intellectual endeavor as a manly pursuit?
Yes, I do. I think the idea of success
Hmm.
in a Jewish household, certainly in my household, was not how fast I could run, or how many
Hmm.
home runs I could hit, or even though again my father was very athletic and I was fairly athletic too, but it wasn't that. That wasn't what they were proud of. But um, if I was creative, if I wrote an interesting essay for my classes, if I played chess well, if I um, when at some point I won like a third prize in a provincial math a contest in grade 8. That was, they were terribly proud of that because that was
Hmm.
what mattered more than anything else. The idea of the intellectual pursuit mattered a lot. And I also think that, being Jewish and learning Jewish tradition and learning Torah is part of who we are and what it's all about. And that helps you focus on priorities, which are intellectual priorities rather than physical or other priorities. I also, like in terms of being an international relations professor, I tie that back to one of the formative experiences for me when I was 5 years old. We were from a traditional household, so we didn't typically listen to the radio on Sabbath or holidays.
Hmm.
But when I was 5 years old, a Yom Kippur War broke out, and all of a sudden the radio was on 24 hours a day, even on
Hmm.
the Sabbath and even on the Sukkot holiday, because it was something that was very important or very central
Hmm.
to my parents and to so. I think that had me learn from a very young age that there's a need for, there's a need for security, there's a need for peace, these are things that really inculcated my brain. Um, and I think made me interested in matters of, politics of peacemaking, which is what I write a lot about.
Yeah, I had a similar experience with, I mean, obviously the September 11th attack were the epoch of my youth. But even before September 11th, I was very culturally aware of the nature of terrorism and the nature of international violence because of the Second Intifada. It was talked about in my house
Mhm.
quite frequently, and was a bit of a political awakening. Not as much as what would come as part of it with the September 11th attack, but certainly it was it it did not come out of left field for me, as I think it came out of left field for a lot of people. And I was still a young person then. I was in high school.
Right. Yeah, these formative influences and how your parents react
Mm,
can really shape how you think about the world and what your
mm,
priorities are. And I see that definitely for me.
mm,
So both my love of literature and my passion and interest in international politics trace from that.
mm. And so you are a bit of an international person yourself. You're from Toronto.
From Montreal
Oh,
initially.
you're from Montreal. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
I was born in Montreal. I lived in Toronto for uh, 15 years initially. I've been back there since as well. But so I lived in Montreal for 7 years, Toronto for 15 years, but then I moved back to Montreal after getting a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania.
oh, oui. Yes, Montreal is actually the city in Canada that I'm most familiar with because you could drive up there and get a beer at 18, and also get delicious shredded meat poutine at Dunn's Poutine,
Sure.
and you know, and then make a mess of yourself on St. Catherine Street. But
Yeah, I mean, everybody 18 goes to the Peel pub, right?
yes. Well, and now you're living in the United States. Do
Yeah.
you consider yourself a Canadian author? You clearly consider yourself a Jewish author, as you and I have discussed, and as I also consider myself a Jewish author because there are foundational moral ideas that I believe, come from my understanding of Judaism and the Jewish religion. But do you consider yourself a Canadian author or an American author now that you're in the United States?
I consider myself an author.
Okay.
So I have setting is very important to me. Geography is very
Hmm.
important to me. I think geography it interacts with the character and the story.
Hmm.
And if you took any one of my stories and set it in a different place, it would have profound consequences for the story and for the character. Uh,
Hmm.
um, it's a long way around to say the first novel that I wrote, The Oracle of Spring Garden Road, is set in primarily two locations, Toronto and Halifax in
Hmm.
Canada, with a chapter in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Halifax and Toronto are cities that I've lived in and know very well. Uh, that is a Canadian novel. And not that it's
Hmm.
not, anybody could understand the themes, and it's readable by Canadians, Americans, or anyone around the world. And I've given talks about the novel and gotten audiences in multiple countries around the world. But that is more of a Canadian novel.
Hmm.
However, I've written novels like my forthcoming novel, Bullet Holes, which is about, how do I put this? It's about the contemporary moment in American society where people um, can't have conversations with people who disagree with them
Hmm.
politically. And this, tries to hold a mirror up to that within a family in Lower Merion, Pennsylvania, suburban Philadelphia, in fact, where I live, fictional story, but and that is very much an American novel.
Hmm.
So it depends what I'm writing when I'm writing it. But I think the advantage of having lived so many years in both Canada and in the United States is that at home in both places, and I can get into the mindset the culture, the geography of both countries so that when I can write about them very comfortably.
This is interesting. You being in an international relations professor and having that experience of living in both countries, what would you say is the most noticeable difference between the sort of Canadian political social culture and the American political social culture? Obviously, now I'd ask de Tocqueville, but we're a ways out from him. But it's interesting. It's an interesting question because, of course, you're writing a novel set in the United States, and then you've written novels set in Canada, and I've been contemplating writing a novel set right on the border
Yeah.
uh, between the United States and Canada, talking about the sort of social cleavages that have emerged, particularly since 1911, when the border became more regulated
Yeah.
and the past cultural realities of what were basically just French Canadian mill towns and French Maine Franco-American mill towns. They were just French or Quebecois. And now what you have is actually a decided difference culturally that's grown up out of the inability to cross the line. And I think most interestingly, I mean, one of my favorite things is OUIs. That, for example, if you get an OUI on the American side, you can't go to Canada anymore. And in these towns where half the town is in Canada and everyone's related to each other and everyone's family, the Americans can't visit their family members because they've had OUIs, for example, and the Canadian government won't let them in. But on the Canadian side, if you've been prosecuted for the exact same crime, you can actually come into the United States. So not I'm not interested in it from an area of grievance, but rather from a question of sort of how borders divide people and how borders can create or manufacture societal difference, even in a community that is largely homogeneous from a linguistic cultural background.
So that is really interesting. I find that an interesting project you're undertaking. I find the main difference between American culture, political culture, and Canadian. I think the revolution
Hmm.
in the United States, Canada didn't have a revolution, right? We
Hmm.
were eventually progressively granted more independence, but it was never a declaration of independence. It was never pulling away. It was never a
Yeah.
revolution. We didn't actually have to sit down and fight for it or contemplate exactly what our ideals were.
Mm.
In the United States, however, there's a very strong, because of the revolution, there is a very strong allergy to government.
Hmm.
And therefore, Canadians, I think, are much more willing to have government regulation of, um, you know, health health during pandemics. You saw that during COVID. The resistance in the United States to central directives to try to manage
Hmm.
a global health pandemic. Um,
But
resistance
yeah.
in Canada was almost nil, very low. It wasn't no, almost no, that's not accurate, but
Well,
it
other
was
than
it
the
was low.
truckers, yeah.
That's right. It was low. Whereas in the United States, this was something that touched upon core elements of identity, right? Because
Hmm.
I think it's very easy to parody it, and I don't think that's accurate or fair. I just think that Americans have this strong culture of, government doesn't get to regulate us, and we have
Yeah.
to be suspicious of government. I don't think Canadians have that strong suspicion. Now, again, there's cross pollination where certainly the Conservative Party, the Reform Party element of the Conservative Party in Canada it gets cross pollinated from the conservative elements of the Republican Party in the U.S. And so there are definite tie-ins or influences. But I do think that in general, Canadians don't have that in their blood the same way that
Mhm.
Americans do. And I think it's simply because of the founding moment and the importance of independence, of resistance of government overreach in the United States. That's been a formative part of the political culture. And you see that, I see that in so many different elements of American society. The other thing I would say is I think Canadians are more communal.
Mhm.
That is, I think there's more, Americans are much more individualistic. There's this, the myth, and I say myth in, not meaning it's not true, but I mean the myth, like the
Yeah.
story, the ideal of American individualism, and the idea that, you pursue your individual happiness. And I think Canadians are much more focused on community and much more willing, on average, to compromise the individual for a collective, whatever that collective is. And so I think those are the major areas where I've seen, clash in political culture. But beyond that, I think they're rather similar. I also want to say one more thing. You talk about the importance of borders in the work that you're focusing on and how borders shape people who are basically alike.
Yeah.
Um, you hear that in other populations too, not just in human populations. But I remember stories of the deer population in Poland. Two stories about them. One of them is that the fences around Auschwitz and other concentration camps kept the deers out. And the
Mhm.
deers passed that on from generation to generation so that in the 1990s and 2000s, early 2000s, you had deer that wouldn't cross where the fences used to be, even though there are no fences anymore.
Mhm.
Because somehow just simply the borders that were created, and it was the same thing, Germany used to be divided from Poland on the Oder-Neisse line, the Oder rivers and the Neisse rivers. And then eventually, after World War II, this Soviet Union pushed westward into eastern Poland, and Poland pushed westward into East Prussia and Upper Silesia. And as a result of that, these rivers were now inside the country and no longer borders. And yet, the wildlife population continued to act for decades afterwards as
As
if
if
they
they were. Yes.
exactly and wouldn't cross the border because they knew that you don't cross there, you can't cross there. Maybe there were electrified fences in the past, I don't know, barbed
Mhm.
wire, but you couldn't do that anymore. And so that tells me that you're onto something because borders, just simply drawing a line and putting a fence, shapes the way populations think and behave.
Yeah, the I think of the one that comes up for me is Mexican cattle versus Texas cattle. So Mexican cattle are actually immune to diseases from certain pests like ticks that exist in Mexico. Whereas once you cross the Rio Grande, the cattle in Texas are not, which is one of these underlying reasons for cattle wars and animosity and trying to sort of impose, even from the early time, this sort of uh, don't bring your tick bearing cattle, which will eventually kill all of the Texas cows because they came from a different place and were bred from different stock and are particularly susceptible to this style of tick, which is such an interesting thing to me.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating. The other, of course, is the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, right? The fact that if you look at the border, on one side there are trees and foliage, and on the other side there's nothing. There's no
Right.
trees and foliage. Uh, it's just interesting questions about borders and about how they shape people and how they affect people. Um, and I'm going to turn it into a horror novel, actually, because I like writing horror novels. But the underlying idea being that once you introduce these arbitrary lines and complicate people's lives, what sort of downward effects does it have on who they are and how they see themselves and see others?
It's a rule of unintended consequences, right? You
Oh,
put
it
something for one
entirely.
reason, and it does so many things that you never anticipated and maybe never wanted.
Hmm. Yes, and it changes, of course, over time.
Hmm.
Yeah. So what were we talking about before we got onto borders?
You asked me if I was a Canadian or American writer, and I mentioned
Yes.
that I feel both in a way.
Mm. And so why don't we go back to the because I did want to ask you about whether you feel that uh, that your academic writing or being a teacher uh, particularly affects the way that you write your stories and your books. Right. So one of the things that I found was that I had to turn off historian Dan and who's quite expository in his writing and turn on fiction author Dan. Do you find that you have to do the same?
I used to have to do that consciously. I don't
Hmm.
anymore. That is, when I started writing fiction, I had to remind myself, and I had to rewrite often and say, well, that's just um, too professor-like. And then I don't really need to do that anymore. I know that I'm doing different things. I'm in a different mindset when I'm writing. One thing that's curious is, or that surprises people, is that except for there's a novel that I'm querying right now, which is this spy thriller. Except
Hmm.
for that, I don't write very much about international relations in my
Hmm.
fiction, and that helps me separate it. So, a lot of people think that I would be writing, international thrillers or story. I set my stories in different places. So I have
Hmm.
like the spy thrillers set in both Washington, D.C. and actually Japan. Um, but and I have stories that are partially, I've novels that have settings in places I've lived, like Australia, for example, or England. But at the same time, in terms of international politics, except for that spy thriller, I've tried to stay away from that. And the other thing I've largely tried to stay away from, I say largely because it does creep in here or there, but I tend not to write about the academy either.
Hmm.
That's not something that um, I feel the need to get into in great measure in my fiction. So here and there, character may be a professor and may be important. I did set a novella that I wrote with one character in my previous university in Montreal, but I've largely kept those two things out of my fiction, and I think that's been nice to be able to separate the two lives that I lead.
Hmm. But I have yeah, I don't particularly like to write uh historian characters. I think mostly because you know the I do the job, so I don't it would just be me writing about what I do. Um I think it's funny the sort of avatars though. I often create uh, white collar male characters who have sort of dull jobs and then foist you know disastrous complications on them. And sometimes I personally do that f for people because I'm inspired by friends or family members I have who have those jobs, and I think it's funny. But what 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 uh what do you use to construct your characters, if not your own experience? Do you use your friends? Do you use your family? Do you use people that you've met? You've obviously traveled a lot.
Characters come to me.
Hmm.
So I don't model a character on anybody that I know. I don't like to do that. Certainly not my family, but I
So you don't have revenge characters.
no, no, no. I don't want to do that. I don't have revenge characters. I don't have, emulation characters. I try to create something that's reasonable or realistic. Songbook, I've got 14 stories with just characters that came to me for different reasons that
Hmm.
compelled me, and they're usually ideas. I think, my first novel, The Oracle of Spring Garden Road, is about a homeless man, very unusual homeless man who inhabits, who panhandles from that, spot near a bank in downtown Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Hmm.
And um, what that whole novel started with was this idea of a an unusual, incongruous homeless man. So he's a homeless man who's highly intelligent. He is very well educated. Clearly, he shows that he's got graduate and postgraduate education. Clearly, he is extremely erudite, but he also doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, he doesn't do drugs. And so he's an enigma for the locals because they wonder, well, why is someone like him with all the advantages homeless here? Um, it just created, it was just this idea that came to me. It's not because I was thinking of anyone that I knew, because I don't know anyone in that situation, but it was just a puzzle for me, and it was exercising me for a while and I was thinking, okay, so why is he homeless? And why
Hmm.
doesn't he get off the streets? What's going on? And that's how the story came around the character. So it wasn't like I had a model for the character. And only afterwards did I do the research to try and investigate, well, what is homelessness like in Halifax, Nova Scotia? Would he be going to a shelter? I, went to the shelters there. Would he be going to food banks? And I got a picture of the story that I was creating plus, what reality was like, and try to merge that into the polished story that I have now. So that's a model of how characters come to me. I think of people in situations, people with particular character flaws. I like, I find um, perfect people are uninteresting, right?
This is true.
Someone asked
They're
me,
quite dull.
they are. Someone
Yes.
asked me why, why would I write about a homeless man? And I said, well, I mean, in tongue in cheek, I said, because, writing about a character who decides to be an international relations professor and then write fiction on the side is awfully dull and boring. Or writing about someone who wants to be, who becomes a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant, these are all really dull. An architect, these are dull things to do because it's a pretty simple, straightforward story. But on the other hand, writing a story about someone who has the capacity to do whatever he wants, but then ends up, on the street. Well, that's a much more compelling story. And so I like people's flaws. I think I don't understand a character, and I don't have a character that I can write until I understand his or her contradictions,
Hmm.
because that's what being human is about, and that's what makes something compelling. Um, so yeah, I mean, characters are not based on anybody that I know. But on the other hand, of course, I'm informing them within the realm of my experience, because
Hmm.
it I can't really escape the realm of my experience, no matter how much I want to. Everything gets filtered through my brain. So yes, I suppose that there are elements of what I'm familiar with or what I can describe or what I can understand, even when I'm imagining something that's very far from my experience.
Mhm. So, what are some, because I often get asked this by dad literati listeners, what are some books that you've read that inspire your writing and inspire your experience as an author that you've drawn from, or even that you just particularly suggest and think that people should read?
So there's a lot that I can throw out. First, I love Graham Greene. I think
Hmm.
that reading Graham Greene taught me more about writing than anything else that I've done. I love his style. I love how he weaves his personal experience into his writing, but only so far. I love the fact that he's very creative about his character interactions. He also pays attention to the mundane and
Hmm.
how the mundane either expresses action or emotion or sometimes mirrors it. And The Power and the Glory is a wonderful novel. I think the heart of the matter, creates unforgettable character in Scobie. I think Power and the Glory is another just brilliant novel that I just love those two. And so I definitely recommend anybody who hasn't read them should read those two novels. Um, I think, in terms of short stories, I like Milan Kundera, although I often find he goes too far down into things that I'm less interested in. But he's got a short story in Laughable Loves. He's got two short stories there that are really great. One of them is No One Will Laugh, which I think captures the essence of Eastern European communism, at least in Czechoslovakia, brilliantly. And it's just written brilliantly, and everything is set up. The personalities and the setting and the story work together to create the disaster that happens. But even better than that, I think, in terms of understanding people, he has a story about a couple. Also set in Czechoslovakia, like just about everything he wrote. But he's got a story that called The Hitchhiking Game, which understands the dynamic, I think, between a man and woman in a couple brilliantly. And it's just perfect. I read that and immediately read it again and again and thought, this is a master. And I had, even though I wasn't imitating anybody when I was writing, but I had that very much burned in my brain when I started writing Songbook, just in terms of the level of understanding, the depth of understanding of human beings that he had. And I wish that, I don't expect that I came anywhere close to that, but I wish that somehow or other I approached him in some of my better stories like that. I think, the first story that I start with, for example, A Weekend at the Cottage. I hope that maybe I got somewhat close to that because those are brilliant stories, and Hitchhiking Game is brilliant. I think of actually like his novel, not Unbearable Lightness of Being, which I thought was very good, but I actually preferred his novel The Joke, which I really think was, again, he's displayed his skill as an observer of human nature. And
Hmm.
I really enjoyed that. And I think that's a lesser known. That's one that I would point to that most people probably don't have on their reading list. And I'd say it's worth the look because he really gets people. I think he nailed it there more so than The Unbearable Lightness of Being. Um, Other books that I'd recommend that are really powerful. I loved The Heart of Darkness. I loved Conrad, Heart of Darkness and The Secret Agent, but I prefer The Heart of Darkness. And the funny thing is, when I read it the first time, or rather, when I didn't read it the first time, because I couldn't get more than 5 pages through it. Because when I was a teenager, being a typical teenager, I was assigned this. Actually, I'll reveal my shame to the entire podcast. But a we had to read this over the winter break, and we had a quiz on it in January when we got back. And a friend of mine read it. I read 5 pages and I just found it. I called it the epitome of boredom. I thought it was the worst book that was ever written. And a friend of mine read it. And so I asked him to tell me about it. And we had a quiz. And of course, we had some questions that required you to extrapolate and whatever it was. He ended up getting a 72 on the quiz and I got 100, which was, which was, he was very resentful afterwards. And I completely get that. But I read that when I was 30 afterwards, and I was blown away because I realized that I just wasn't good at listening to the silences, which
Mhm.
you needed to be. And I think that actually helped me as a writer as well to listen to the silences or to think of the silences. It's not just action. If I could criticize anything about contemporary writing standards now, and the requirements is that you have to have action, 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 action on the first page. And I think that the
Nothing
silences,
but action.
yeah, getting to know the characters, steeping in the setting, um, setting things up slowly, carefully, deliberatively, I think is so much more rewarding
Mhm.
than and Conrad was a master. I say Conrad would never get published nowadays, and we'd be a poorer as a civilization if he didn't get published. I love
Mhm.
Kieran Desai's first book. She's got a new book out. I haven't read it yet, but it's on my list because I'd read anything of hers. But she has this book, The Inheritance of Loss, which was just brilliant. She understood she kept everything in the air. She kept the characters. She kept the the setting, the story, and juggle that perfectly to the point where I feel again, if I could approach that, if I approach that in my writing, then I'd be very gratified. And then I'll mention a Canadian Jewish author that I love that may be on some people's radars in the United States. Mordecai Richler happens to be a
Well,
Montrealer as
yeah,
well.
the great Canadian novel by Mordecai Richler,
Well,
according to Craig Turleson.
Yeah,
Yes.
so his best novel was, I think, his last Barney's version. And
Mm.
Barney's version, he was great with the apprenticeship of Judy Kravitz. I liked where he was going in the Solomon Gursky was here, but I felt there are moments of brilliance in that novel, and I really loved the novel. But at the end, I felt by about 2/3 of the way through, I felt that he was dropping all those balls that he had in the air and he couldn't, it was too wide a canvas for him to paint because he was dealing with
Mm.
many generations and he just couldn't tie it all together. And so in the end, I felt somewhat dissatisfied, even though it was absolutely, you saw the brilliance in that. But then he wrote Barney's version and he did it over a much smaller sweep of time with one primary character, and he nailed it. I mean, it was an incredible book. So that
Mhm.
I think everybody should read as well. And I just love the way he's got 3 sections in the novel, one for each, one for Clara, one for the second Mrs. Panofsky, because she's never named in the entire book, and then third for Miriam. But as you're going through 2/3 of Clara, you still haven't gotten to Clara yet because he's still talking about Miriam, who's the love of his life, who's number three. And I just thought he just nailed that. It was just perfect. So I loved that book as well, and I'd recommend that as well.
Mhm.
One comment about Canadian, we're talking about Canadian versus American and writing Canadian novel. I think of Northrop Frye, who actually went to the University of Toronto University College, which was my college at the University of Toronto. But he said famously, boy meets girl, that's a compelling story. Boy meets girl in Winnipeg, who the hell cares?
Yeah, it remains an interesting question of what makes the great American versus what makes the great Canadian novel, and something we'll continue to explore. Do you have any thoughts on that? What makes the great Canadian versus the great American novel, other than obviously when it where the author is physically from?
I think I think location, I mean, Richler, in order to get into Richler, for example, who I think is brilliant Canadian novelist. It very much a question of space, geography, inside Canadian politics, etc.
Hmm.
Um, whereas the American novelist is less interested in things outside of the United States, I think, in many respects,
Hmm.
because the United States is so vast, large population. Canada's a larger territory, but no one actually goes to most of the places in Canada. 90% of the population lives within a 2-hour drive of the American border. So most of the vast Canada is simply, uninhabited or sparsely inhabited. Um, but I think also the importance of the United States to the world is the importance of the United States to commerce, to industry, to security, to the international politics. I think the American contribution to the world is far larger than the Canadian contribution has ever been. And so I think it makes sense for Americans to be focused on the United States, which is almost a universe in and of itself, whereas Canadian authors are more um, focusing on other areas, not just
Hmm.
Canada, but other areas. And I think um, so there's a geographical difference. There's also just a sense of maybe a sense of inferiority amongst Canadian authors trying to figure out, well, how do we fit in? How do we connect to people? How do we write something that's relatable outside of a country that nobody knows all that much about? I think there may be elements of that as well.
Hmm. So do you want to plug your works before we
Yeah,
close out?
yes, I'd love to. So first, let me talk to you. So talk about three things. I'll talk about Songbook, which is a
Hmm.
collection of 14 short stories. I think I mentioned based on influenced by, inspired by classic rock, or connected in my mind with it afterwards. And it's a unified uh, set of stories, very different stories, even though they're unified on that theme of classic rock and inspiration and the music of life. But I have different, stories with characters of different ages, different um, milieus, and some different styles. I have satire. I have very serious considerations of life. I have fathers and sons. The last story, I think you read this, which is Little Piece of Heaven, is I think a beautiful story of a relationship between a father and a son after the mother dies in childbirth, and the father is all that the son has.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's the short story collection. I have the novel Oracle of Spring Garden Road, which is a it's two novels in one. First is, the character that I told you of, that homeless person, the unusual homeless person. Why is he there? And so that story is told in alternate chapters. I alternate between present, past, present, past, present, past throughout the
Hmm.
book. And in the past, you meet the character that becomes Crazy Eddie, as they call him, on the streets of Halifax, and you learn where he comes from and why he falls to the street eventually, because of his singular character and set of circumstances. And the second novel in the present is he's been on the street for 20 years and he decides that he needs to reintegrate with society. But it's been a long time and it's hard, and he doesn't want to work with people. But there's a woman, an older woman named Jane, who he finds his intellectual equal, which is unusual because he thinks he's superior to everybody. But he finds in Jane his
Yeah.
intellectual equal, and he decides that he comes up with a plan to use her assistance to get him off the street, but only in return for doing her a great service as well. And so the question is he able to get off the streets, or is it too late? And that's the second novel in there. And then the third book that I'll plug, it's a little early. The publisher is probably putting it out early in the new year. It's called Bullet Holes. And that is, I mentioned about, it's a political novel, and in many respects, it's a novel about school shootings. It's a novel about a family that has been, for 22 years, has been the model American family, in that He is ultra conservative. He's a Trump supporter. He's a Second Amendment supporter. He's from a religious Jewish background. His wife, on the other hand, is very liberal, is from a secular background, is very much against the Second Amendment, very much in favor of abortion rights. And that has never been a problem as they've lived their lives for 22 years, and they've really been a model. They've been um, a wonderful family, wonderful relationship that everyone loves and wants to emulate until something happens. And they're coming together for the bar mitzvah of their younger son, and all these families are coming together while while there are simmering tensions that are trying to tear them apart. And so that takes place over the weekend of the bar mitzvah, and I think is very contemporary, very current. And my thinking in that novel, there's a movie I saw many years ago, in probably the 2000s, first decade of the 2000s, called The Lives of Others,
Hmm.
German movie. I don't know if you saw it, but
Yeah, yeah.
so what I loved I loved the movie, but then I listened to an interview with the director, and the director said that what he was trying to do, he heard the story about Maxim Gorky talking to Lenin, and Lenin said, "I love the Appassionata, but I want to ban that. I'd love to ban that piece of music." And Gorky said, "But why? If you love it so much?" And Lenin said, "Because when I hear that music, it's so beautiful and it brings tears to my eyes and it makes me want to reach down and stroke the head of the person next to me. But for my revolution, I need to smash that head in with a hammer." And the director said, "I was wondering, and I was exercised when I was writing this movie. I was exercised with the idea, what if what if we forced Lennon to listen to the music?" And
Hmm.
that's when he figured, how would we force him? And then he thought, okay, let's make this Stasi officer, this very orthodox Stasi officer, listen to these artists,
Hmm.
a playwright and his wife who is an actress, and let's let him listen to them and see what it does to him. And that's the kind of thinking I had when I was coming up with this novel. What I do is I tell the story from the perspective of different characters. So the action moves forward, each chapter from a different perspective, so that it actually forces people to get into the heads of people who are not at all like them, whatever their perspective is. I don't go in to judge, and I don't go in there to tell the story from my perspective. I go in to see the world through the lenses of these different characters who view the world very, very differently in many different respects. And there are about 6 or 7 characters that whose heads you get into in this novel. And so I think this is a great opportunity for people to get into the heads and really think about the humanity of people that they don't agree with.
Well, that's lovely. Well, thank you, Norrin. That's author, dad, and professor Norrin Ripsman.
Thank you very much. This is wonderful. I enjoyed the conversation.
I enjoyed it as well. Thank you again.
Our time together has come to an end. It's time to return to your wife, kids, and friends. It's time to pick up those books you forgot while you wait for the next dad lit part.